to escape what was happening in my country. And then when we found out we were going to be going to the U.S. with my uncle through a refugee program, we were very excited in the sense that we finally felt like we could be safe somewhere. We could have a safe place to start our lives again. It was difficult adjusting in the very beginning, and the refugee program that we went through was very rigorous, and it took about 6 or 8 months.
So what is the refugee program?
So the refugee program, I don't know if has changed much today, but I do remember that we had to apply for refugee status, and that was out of Croatia. So we first had to stay in Croatia and await the approval of the U.S. government. And the U.S. government opens it up to sponsors, so-called sponsors, and these are just American citizens who have the ability to host a family or an individual and provide them with food, shelter, the basic needs, pathways to a job, and perhaps put them in contact with some volunteer organizations, some churches. And so once you're put, into that program, you there's that waiting period to be approved. And it just so happens that we were approved to move to Branford, Connecticut, where our sponsor and her husband were living. And so it was quite the trial. My father had to go through a lot of interviews, in order to get our green card. And you get put on food stamps for the first couple of months, and you have a job, and you're put into adult ed learning classes. And your family, like I said, is put into in touch with organizations that are able to help us.
This may seem like a silly question, but did you miss your Bosnian family back in Europe? And also, what did your immediate family do to create home and a sense of community?
So the people who we left behind, closest to us were my aunt and my grandmother, and of course my schoolmates. However, a lot of people that we had known, our neighbors and friends, had already left. So all of us were sort of dispersed and leaving into different parts of the world. So I miss those who stayed behind. I miss my grandmother a lot, but I knew that we had no option. I mean, this was just sort of set in stone. We're leaving.
Well, Himan says that there were only a few Bosnians in the beginning, but as the war escalated, that more came. So more of them came to Bridgeport or to Connecticut.
We were one of the first families. The Hadzik family we were one of the first ones in that area of Connecticut, and it was just my father and his brother and the families, and then eventually you could sponsor other people to come. So we sponsored my aunt, sponsored my dad's friends, and sponsorship, all that really means is provide them with, like I said, shelter, food, and means to get a job. And if they pass the process, they're able to come in. So, again, that's how we started building a sense of community. At first, like I was saying earlier, it was just a small group of Bosnians. And then it started building because of that ability to sponsor someone, to bring someone over. And then slowly over time, larger communities developed, especially New York and Chicago, and of course now parts of Connecticut.
Tell us about some of your personal adjustments, language, culture, even food, practices, friendships, etc. Tell a little bit about what you had to adjust to. And I'm not using the word assimilate because I'm not sure that's what you're telling me.
Yeah.
But tell me some of those experiences.
So the most shocking thing was the language, because I knew some English through television, music, videos, or things like this, but I couldn't quite put the grammatical structures together. So that was the most difficult, not being able to communicate to those around me. So I felt very enclosed with it's just myself, my brother, my mom, and my dad. That the outside world was very difficult to kind of get around. Once we were in school, it felt a little easier because there were teachers. My ESL teacher, Miss Moon, I'll never forget her. She was very positive in pushing me in the direction to learn the language very fast, which I did. I acquired it. I was almost fluent in about 5 months. Because you have no choice. You don't have a Bosnian community to go to. If you want to go to the grocery store, you have to know the language. If you need to call the doctor, you have to. So we had to learn the language very, very fast. So that was one area. That was difficult. The second one was just a change in pace in the lifestyle in U.S. you feel like a stranger. You don't know people in the street. And yet Americans, I found, those who wanted to help and volunteer were very open. The ones who helped us out opened their homes to us, and they took care of my family. And then as far as the food is concerned, we've never seen such an abundance. And it's not that we didn't have food in Bosnia, we did, but there was this sense of like everything is huge. The pizzas are ginormous, and I was saying before, I hated Doritos, and now of course I'm adjusted. So your palate has to get used to that. And everything was just, like I said, large portions and just huge amounts. I said, how do they eat so much? So that was interesting. And trying to preserve our Bosnian way of like cuisine and cooking and culture, while at the same time trying new things like bagels and cream cheese were like the greatest discovery. So that was our favorite.
At what point did you feel like this was your home?
So I went back to Bosnia when I turned 21, and going back was sort of almost felt like a dream, because I remembered it as a child. I remember that in my mind, everything was huge. All the buildings were, tall, and the streets were wide. And then I came back as an adult, and everything was just, I was looking at it from a different perspective. So I felt like that was my home in the past. And then what ended up happening is my father and my uncle got a two-family house in Branford, Connecticut, on the shoreline. It was very nice. And I want to say I was in 8th grade. That's when it really felt like I have a house now where my family's staying. I have a yard. I could invite my friends over. Before that, we were living in and out of apartments. So it felt temporary. This felt real. It felt like we had finally... Ownership. And we had finally sort of established our roots. We sort of said it. Yeah.
Hemon was truly surprised and disturbed by the devastation he saw when he returned to Bosnia 5 years later. In your hometown, did you see any of that devastation or any effects of the war there?
Well, the one thing that it's difficult for a lot of foreigners to understand is that Sarajevo was definitely the city under siege because it's surrounded by mountains. So it was very easy for snipers to sort of target civilians. My city was where those aggressors, and they are Orthodox Serbs or Orthodox Christians, they were the aggressor. And so after shelling Sarajevo, where are they going to go? They went to my city. And so what happened is they converted my city into their sort of home base. So anybody who was Muslim, so my father is Muslim, my mother is half Orthodox, half Catholic, so that was unacceptable, that we were ethnically cleansed out of my country. So these Serbian aggressors would come to my city and just make, if you are Muslim, you had to leave your home. You were forced to leave, and you had nobody to appeal to. You couldn't go to the government, you couldn't go to the police, you just had to leave, you had to survive. So my city, really the devastation was in all the buildings that resembled any Ottoman Empire. So anything that resembled, if it's a mosque, it was destroyed. If it was a home, a clock tower. So my city, the devastation was more that these were strangers. When I went back, I said, who are these new people? Because they basically chased all of the original citizens out, and all of these new people moved in. So my city felt almost like, I know the buildings, I recognize the scenery, but the city feels different because the people make the city. Yeah. So that's the devastation I felt, like I was among strangers.
How is Bosnian family life compared to American life? One of the things that Hemon says in his story, he says that in Bosnia, there's no such thing as privacy. That your family is into all of your business.
Yes.
So how's that different?
So the closest I could describe it to, and a lot of Americans understand it this way, is like a large Italian family or a large Greek family. That sort of Mediterranean, Balkan kind of, my big fat Greek wedding. That's kind of, the closest I could describe it to. So the family unit is very strong. And at times,